There. Now, Changing Times, Changing Worlds Conference brings you Otherworldly, the Wednesday show, and to enliven your night and on into your day with your host, Chipicon, and our guest tonight is Sidney Eileen. Today we are looking at death and how we speak of them, how it affects them, and it affects us. So let's begin. I have pushed the button. So thank you for listening and Sidney. See, in case you did not know, I encountered Sidney writing about this topic on Patheos, and since I did, I have read a half a dozen of her things, and I wanted to come back and talk about a lot of them. I'm hoping to get her for the conference. So I'm planning on it. Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to you and start where you like. I'd say kind of focus on this one topic because I do want to have you back for other topics. Didn't realize you were pretty. Yeah, anonymity of print, you know? Okay, sorry. So Sidney Eileen, let's pin you on that. So
yeah, all right. So a little bit who I am. My name is Sidney Eileen, and I am animistic, polytheistic, pagan witch. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm not part of any established traditions. I've always been solitary and mostly work intuitively. And so I am 40, I just turned 43. Yeah, I always have to count it. I can never remember exactly how old I am. And I started writing publicly about witchcraft, paganism, and other associated cultural, social topics about a year and a half ago now. That's when I started blogging on Patheos. Originally, I was on the Agora channel, and then I've had my own solo blog, The Balancing Path, since June of 2020. And so if you want to find my stuff, I also have my own website, which is sydneyeileen.com, and everything I do gets funneled through there. So if you ever want to find anything I do, you can find links or it posted there. So what we're going to be talking about today is speaking ill of the dead and why it is not a bad thing to do. But you still have to be sensitive about respecting the grieving process, but sometimes not speaking, being willing to speak ill of the dead can be an important part of the grieving process for a lot of people. And it's a topic I had been considering writing about, had been on my list for about a year before I actually wrote about it. And the impetus to actually write it was the death of I'm sorry, his name just went out of my head because I don't like him. It was, I'm sorry.
Rush Limbaugh.
Rush Limbaugh. Yeah, because he is a blight as far as I'm concerned. And every time someone who is problematic dies, whether they are big problematic or small problematic, you always hear people saying, don't speak ill of the dead. And the justification is, well, they're dead, so they can't do any more harm. And why would you want to throw that in the face of people who are grieving? And, just say nice things about them because they died. And that really doesn't work, because if you ignore the things that people have done, you ignore the legacy of the harm they've done, and you continue to pile erasure on top of the harm they did to the people that they harmed. And in the case of someone like Rush Limbaugh, he has a huge legacy that will continue to do harm for decades to come, because he has been so influential to conservative thought for decades. He's written so many books, he has done so many of his shows, he has done so many public appearances, and pretty much anyone who wasn't a white Christian man was on his frankly shit list. So he was cruel to everybody else. He would celebrate when AIDS deaths were happening in the 80s. He did all sorts of awful things. Frankly, I didn't follow most of what he did because I can't. I get too angry and upset when I follow that sort of pundit. But if you're paying even the tiniest amount of attention, you know what kind of harm he was doing. He was a white supremacist who literally hated everybody who wasn't a white male Christian. And when you impart that kind of harm, I felt like it needed to be stated that yes, I am allowed to say he was a horrible person and people shouldn't be mourning him and he shouldn't be celebrated because of all of the harm that he did. And part of the reason for that is because when you look at the flow of history and if you look at the traumas that are inflicted on people, there are different levels. There's the personal traumas of the people that are close to them that they directly harm. There are the next out circle, the people that are influenced by the people that they influence. And then it goes out from there and out from there and out from there to greater society when you talk about somebody with that kind of influence. So you have those different layers of harm, but they're all valid. So like I also talked a little bit about some of my personal thing and also a bit about some problematic figures in paganism, because there are a lot of them. And some of them are very widely read and even today very widely regarded, like Aleister Crowley. And he wasn't like Lovecraft was really problematic, extremely bigoted and racist, but his works are still extremely influential in the pagan community. And then there's the whole debate of how do you separate the art from the artist, which is something I didn't get into in the article, but it's worth touching on. So when you're talking about personal trauma and harm, that's the most common that most of us will run into, is there is a relative or a family member or somebody else who is part of your immediate circle, whether you want them to be or not, who has caused you a lot of harm. Because abusive people are very good at grooming victims and they're good at grooming allies. So when you have an abusive person in a circle, especially in a family, you'll have some people who will be all glowing praise and you'll have some people who are like, but what this person did that everybody else might even completely deny. So I have problematic history with my family to the point where I don't talk to anyone in my immediate family and I don't expect to ever again for the rest of my life. And if I were to be in contact with them and say, go to their funerals, I really would have very little nice to say. And that's just a simple fact. And if I were to be expected to stand up there and give some sort of a eulogy, I would not be able to give a glowing, nice eulogy that would address the grief of those who actually miss them, because that isn't my experience with them. I am so much happier without them in my life that it's a tragedy. So, but sometimes, depending on your family dynamic, you can't just walk away. And you do end up being expected to go to the funeral and you are expected to say nice things. And yeah, that's why in like movies and television shows, if you have that kind of a dynamic and it's the protagonist, you end up walking through that whole story with them and you know what has happened to them that made them so hurt by this person who has since died. And then if the funeral happens and this person gets up there and, sorry, I've got to mute that. That person gets up on the pulpit and talks about and says the truth about what happened to them because, well, they didn't ask to be there. They were required to be there, and they speak their truth. And that can be an important cathartic healing thing. And when you watch that kind of a movie, you go on that journey with them and you feel that catharsis with them, and you understand what it means to them to be able to say it out loud, even in front of people who still want to deny it in all likelihood. So it'll show like the shocked faces in the crowd, and then the people who actually do know what was going on but didn't have the courage to say anything, like practically looking like they want to stand up and clap. And it's a trope in movies because that's a truth of how our society fails to deal with trauma and death. So as individuals and as pagans, it's really important to give room for that kind of healing. But at the same time, you don't want to interrupt other people's grieving processes. So like one of the things I mentioned in the article was that I was perfectly free to go online and say, he was horrible. And I'm not interrupting anyone's grieving process. If they want to troll me out and go, but you're wrong, that's on them. I wasn't saying it directly to them. I'm not going to his family and telling them that they should hate him. I'm not interrupting their grieving process. But something that wouldn't even have occurred to me to do is sometimes people will troll to those bereaved loved ones and actually try and interact on their social media and tell them that this person was awful. And that's just messed up because they have their own grieving process, and you know, for whatever reason they liked him and had good associations and they miss him. Someone as blatantly horrible as Limbaugh, that's a pretty good indication they're a horrible person too, or they wouldn't be that into them. But most of the time it's not that black and white. Most of the time there are good things and there are bad things about a person. All of us are a mixture. We're not 100% good. We're not 100% bad, no matter how we try to be. And so you have to allow for that, and you need to give that space for people who are holding on to those things. Plus there is the whole issue of like trauma bonds, where you end up in a relationship where you know somebody hurts you deeply, but you still love and cherish them very much. And it's a very torturous, mixed feeling thing. And grief becomes incredibly complicated for people who are stuck in that kind of a dynamic and that kind of an emotional maelstrom when the person who has hurt them that they still love dies. You know? So if you go and pile on, oh, they're horrible, on somebody who's trying to grieve the parts that they love while still respecting the stuff that hurt and being relieved that the hurt stuff is not going to be continuing, but they're still going to miss these other things, it becomes a very complicated thing for them. And when other people step in and start either bashing or demanding that they only engage in the positive things, yeah, sorry, I got distracted by the chat for a sec. You need to leave them the ability to do both, or they can never heal from it. It really is profoundly important on a personal level to be able to acknowledge the good and the bad. And grief is complicated and individual for every single one of us. And every single time we grieve, it's different, whether it's a person or a pet, or even a car, or your beloved cell phone that just died a really unfortunate death, or convention events that may never happen again. We can grieve anything. If we miss something, we grieve it. And the process is different every time for every single person and every single thing they grieve. And so it's not a straight line. Like the, steps of grieving is a good guideline for what you will probably touch on as you grieve, but it's not a straight line. And I know when I've grieved things in the past, I'll jump from anger to acceptance and back to denial and then back to anger. And I'll tend to jump around depending on my mood, and which aspects of the grief I am currently processing. As I have cultivated for myself a lot of self-honesty, and your emotions are your emotions. You can't control your emotions. You can deal with them, but you can't control them. And that's an important distinction to make. If somebody can have been the most awful person in the world to you, and if you still love them, you still love them, and you can't help that. If there is a part of me that still feels some love for my parents despite everything, but it got kicked so many times that I can't even with them anymore. So I'm not sure how I'm going to feel when they die. I really am not, because I'm not there. They're not dead. And I still have a lot of stuff that I'm working through in regards to things that happened between us. And I don't know where that's eventually going to lead. But when you're talking about public figures who are harmful, it's a different kind of grief, because people who never met them, but whose lives they touched, will still grieve for them. Like, well, one of the examples from paganism that I put in there was also Gardner, because it's generally considered that he was probably a bigot because of some of the things that he did when setting up Wicca. But an interesting point is that at the time that he was setting up Wicca, it was still illegal to be a gay man in England. So it was barely legal to be a witch. So he would have needed to avoid absolutely any appearance of encouraging homosexuality in order to avoid legal problems. And I don't know as much about that as I kind of wish I did. I asked around when I was writing the article, and a couple people confirmed that yes, that was probably a problem, but nobody has actually really published on it. And I would love to see that social commentary on England at the time and its laws and how that would have affected things. Because realizing that makes me think, well, maybe he wasn't a bigot. Maybe he was just doing the best he could with the legal situation he was in at the time. And because of that structure that he created, people who are bigots and transphobes latched onto it and have turned it into a gender essentialist problematic thing.
Are you suggesting he was gay? Or
I have no idea if he was or not. I don't know. I've never read a biography on him, but I'm saying that people have at times conflated queerness and witchcraft, because both are vilified within Christianity. And like being queer is a path to the devil, doing witchcraft is a path to the devil. So it becomes a thing. So he had to make it as unthreatening as possible in order to gain public legitimacy and not be persecuted into the laws being changed back to witchcraft being illegal. So there are a lot of things in Gardnerian Wicca that to me read like that, but I'm not a Gardnerian Wiccan. I did practice with a couple friends who were Gardnerian Wiccan for a few months at one point, but it wasn't for me. The structure, the formality of it really didn't work for me. So it's not my area of expertise, but it is one of those things that everybody in paganism is aware of. Everybody has heard of Gardner, everybody has heard of Wicca, everybody has run into Wiccans. And so it's an interesting footnote to look at that and go, was he really as problematic as people are thinking he might have been, or was it just the circumstances of his time? And I don't know
the
the answer.
circumstances of his time had a huge impact.
Yeah. And
I think that everything that went past when Wicca hit feminism, when Wicca hit, at various different times, oh, I love your cup. there's always interaction in the evolution of our various spiritual practices.
Mhm.
And he had to deal with that. I always figured he was just doing a whole lot of sex because sex was taboo in England. I'm in England, you know.
It might have had something to do with that. He might have been one of those people that just has a really over-the-top sex drive. I myself am asexual, so I find it interesting to watch those dynamics in other people because I'm not sex repulsed. So I find it rather interesting to watch how much energy people expend in that area when I'd rather be doing something else.
I am
It's,
apparently I think, is it cis something, maybe aromantic. I only feel sexual attraction to people that I'm in love with. I know there's a term for it, but I don't keep track of that. I'm not a millennial.
Mhm.
So.
No, honestly, none of these terms exist while I was growing up either. But for me, it's been really validating because it means there is more discussion on the kinds of gender and sexuality I personally have, and there's more public awareness. And I always understood what my gender was, regardless of not having a label, but it made it really hard to talk about.
Oh, thank
it was
you.
incredibly complicated to try and tell anybody what it was because I'm non-binary. There still isn't a perfect label, and there usually isn't. It's pretty rare to find a perfect label.
I want you to come back and talk about all the benefits of getting rid of the binary gender system. I'm hoping to get that one for the conference because it's huge. But
I will definitely be submitting that. I'm trying to get together 4 things because the form allows 4 submissions. So I'll be sending that in the next week or so. But yeah, back to
death. I have studied it myself, and in different cultures, most of the traditions around funerals tend to be whatever is going to make sure the dead person stays dead and doesn't come back. That's what most, and yes, it's aimed at helping the living to grieve, but the purely magical aspects of funerals tend to be you get over there and stay over there. I study in different cultures, and it's all you see a lot of it in vampire lore and things like that.
Yeah, I'm not really well versed in funeral practices. A lot of what I've spent time looking into and contemplating have to do with personal processes and societal processes of grief and how we handle the aftermath of the dead. Yeah, in funeral practices, I know sometimes there are even like 2 things. One part of it's definitely for the people who are grieving, and one part of it is for the dead. Whatever it is that the cultural context wants to do with the dead, whether it's make sure they don't come back or make sure they have a nice journey to the other side. Like that's what I consider the big difference in English between a funeral and a wake.
Yeah. Well, if you speak ill of the dead, you might motivate him to come back to get you.
Okay, I see what you're getting.
That can be problematic, you see.
Okay.
When they're passing, they're figuring out, okay, have I finished everything? And if somebody's over here bad-mouthing them, they might stay, and then they would be a problem for everyone.
Okay.
So that's why it is excellent source of funeral practices is Ask a Mortician by Caitlin Doherty on YouTube. There was a
I like Caitlin.
Cherry Hill Seminary had a course on funeral practices, and I'm a cheapskate, and I often buy all the books on the class reading lists and then don't take the class. But there's a lot of good books out there on funeral. Americans are so screwed up on, they don't know how to grieve.
No, we don't. We're so terrified of death. We have blocked ourselves off from grieving, and toxic masculinity plays a huge part in that, especially because men aren't supposed to show any emotions really other than anger. And so it leads to a lot of bottling up and not dealing with it. And I don't know how many people I have seen who will lose somebody that meant a lot to them, and then they drag it around, carry it on their back for the rest of their life and refuse to put it down and let it rest. And it's sad because you can't live your life fully if you're carrying that. There's another article I wrote last year about that grief is most of the time an expression of love. So it is love that has nowhere to go. So if you love somebody and they're not there, how do you express that? So one of the ways you can deal with grief when you're missing someone is to find other ways to express that love, whether it's by doing things in their name or praying at an altar to them on a regular basis, writing letters to them, doing things that they would have enjoyed even though they're not there in their spirit, but finding ways to express that love even though they're gone can be a good way to deal with grief. But we're more trying to talk about when you aren't having that problem. So with public figures, you're talking about a greater influence than just the people who knew them and love them. God, I bawled so hard when Colonel Meow died. I don't know if any of you remember Colonel Meow. He was a celebrity cat he was really young. He was only 3 when he died, and I bawled my eyes out when that cat died. But yeah, you can grieve the funniest things, especially remote over the internet. We have contact with so many people. But with public figures, what you're looking at is a larger influence. So like I mentioned in the article that I would have loved to have picked on Budapest Sea, but she's not dead yet. So I couldn't pick on her. But the reason I wanted to pick on her is because she is a very well-known example of somebody in modern paganism who is held in extremely high regard by certain segments of our giant meandering way of being. And then there are a ton of people that she has caused tremendous harm to because she is so transphobic and so focused on gender essentialism. And she has encouraged that in so many other people. And that legacy of harm will continue after she dies, long after she dies. And unlike with Gardner, which I was talking about earlier, where it's debatable whether or not that was deliberate or a necessity of the circumstances he was trying to practice under. And he didn't directly say that trans people, he would have had different language for it because that language didn't exist at the time, but there's nothing where he said trans people shouldn't be here or that they don't belong or that they're invalid. He just didn't talk about them at all. And Budapest Z is very much anti-trans. So thankfully most conventions won't host her anymore because of that, which I'm glad for. And I don't know if she's even still trying to present at conventions because of that. I haven't looked into it in a while. But the echoes of that harm are wide and they're valid. And if you don't speak ill of the dead, how are you supposed to confront the legacy of that harm? how are you supposed to confront the legacy of that transphobia if you're not allowed to say that the transphobia she promotes is bad and harmful? You can't. You have to speak ill of the dead in order to achieve those sorts of changes. So that's really, really important. So let's see. And I do encourage questions and discussions. So if you have any thoughts, any of you?
I was just thinking, do you remember when Isaac Bonewitz was dying that spring, and there were all over the country, there were drum circles and prayer things going on for him. And I finally wrote on his Facebook, I said, Isaac, it's not up to your fan base. It's up to you. If you are ready to die, go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Just ignore everybody else, do what's good for you. And he died the next day, which was fast enough so that I very much doubt that somebody who was in the middle of dying of cancer read his Facebook page, which meant his widow had to see that. I'm not really unhappy that I said it. It's something that needs to be said.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
At the same time, I would rather have said it to him than to her.
Yeah.
That is an ugly truth. It's like, no, other people can't tell you whether to live or die.
Yeah.
That's something you have to do. But,
but
I wouldn't have caused her pain in that part.
Yeah.
But when my husband died, because we loved him, the first thing that my daughter said when she found out was, Alpine, damn it. And I have told other widows, it's like, look, if you get to the point where you want to yell and scream and you're mad at them for dying on you, call me, I will listen. I understand. There have been times I have been quite cross with my husband for dying. Now, it's not that he did anything wrong, but
Sure.
Our culture is not good at letting people be negative under any circumstance. We don't want to listen to women talk about being raped. We don't want to talk about how hard it is to deal with the medical system. We don't want to talk about how hard it is to be gay or black or anything else. Griping is supposed to be something you keep in. And I think that hurts us. But I'll listen to people if they're unhappy. Again, anybody's listening, you give me a call. Because I can listen to somebody's pain and say, oh my God, that's awful, and not carry it inside me. I know empaths who will take the pain and then hold it. It's like, oh no, you can't do that. Their pain is their pain.
Well,
You're thinking of somebody.
You can be an empath without holding it either. The important part on that is recognizing what is yours and what is theirs, and that is a skill. I used to take on other people's emotions a lot when I was a teenager, and I trained myself to be able to recognize what's me and what's not me, and let the not me go. So I can take it, I can see it, I can deal with it, I can sometimes help people with it, but it's not mine, so I don't have to hold on to it. And that is a skill, and part of being able to get to that point is knowing yourself completely honestly, and being willing to understand those harder emotions, because I don't really consider any of those emotions negative or positive. They're harder or they're more fun. And the hard ones that cause us discomfort and hurt and anxiety, those are the ones that we tend to avoid. And when you avoid those, you can't really know yourself, because they're all a part of you and they're all valuable, and we need all of them. Because if you can't feel that pain, how can you be kind to other people? if you can't feel hurt, if you can't feel grief, how are you supposed to relate to other people who are feeling hurt and who are feeling grief? How can you be a compassionate person if you don't know those feelings for yourself?
It's good.
I have,
Um,
I ask,
I have
since
something
this
I'd
is, oh, I'm sorry, somebody else
yeah,
asked a question?
I
Go.
think one of the problems we encounter is that we see people in snapshots. We don't, if we're not living with someone 24/7 or most of the time, we don't know what the experience is that we're not seeing. And so,
mhm.
can I throw a name out? Is it okay for me to throw a name, a pagan name out?
I believe in naming names,
Okay,
because if
Kenny
you don't
Klein.
name names,
Let me just say, Kenny Klein, all right?
Oh.
Good musician.
oh, right, I remember.
Yeah, yeah, good musician. But what there may be, we might not have ever seen the bottom part of the iceberg of that man's life. And so we have no way, if we weren't there, we have no way of judging whether what has been said about him in his private life was even true or not. And so for my part, I can only mourn the musician. I can't mourn the abusive father, the abusive partner, the other things that have been laid at his door, and that he specifically denied till his dying day. And at that point, I had to just back off from it and say, thanks for the music, Kenny, and that's it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think that's one
Yeah,
of the best reasons not to speak ill of the dead, is because they can't defend themselves anymore. But
yeah,
at the same time, you have to be honest.
well, and as somebody who has dealt with people who habitually lie and gaslight, them not being able to defend themselves means you can actually speak sometimes. Because if you're dealing with somebody who lies and gaslights constantly, which most serious abusers do, because that's how they enable the cycle of abuse, because they have to deny it to the people that they've groomed to be their allies, then you can't tell the truth without them denying it or deflecting it. And it just ends up turning into a cycle of he said, she said. We saw this a ton during the Me Too movement, because people were coming out and saying these things and everybody denied it until there was concrete evidence. They always deny until there's concrete evidence. And even then, some of them deny it. So I don't think that's a bad, I don't think that's a good reason to only speak well of the dead.
It's not enough, but that is one reason. That's
yeah,
given.
and sometimes people who do abusive things, like my parents, what they did out of their own personal unresolved traumas. So I can recognize what happened. They, I am positive, do not see it the way I do. Legitimately, complete denial, do not see how what they did was so harmful. But that doesn't mean that it is any less true. Yeah, that's why I wrote the article after Rush Limbaugh died, because it is absolutely undeniable what he did and what he said and the harm he caused. So it's easy. He's an easy target to be able to make an example of. When you get into interpersonal abuses and interpersonal traumas that are not that public, it becomes far more complicated. And at that point, you've got to let different people get into do their own grieving process and speak their truths. And truth is not a capital T. there's never one truth. There's always multiple ways of looking at things.
I think that's a
I see a
really
hand.
important point. Can I ask from the occult spooky food point of view, what you think happens when for instance, Rush Limbaugh wakes up dead? Is he going to be saying, look at all the good I did? Is he going to continue to be in denial, or is his higher self going to come and say, Rush, you dumb shit, look at this and this and this and the harm you did? We can only speculate, but
yeah, considering that, I'll get to you in a moment, Thor. Considering the harm he deliberately inflicted over the course of decades, I strongly suspect he'll still be proud of what he did. And that's another interesting aspect of not speaking ill of the dead, is it's used as erasure and denial. So all of the things that people like me say that are speaking ill are the same exact things the people who adore him are praising him for. They're saying the same things, but they're saying it with praise. So it becomes a tone police thing, where they're not denying he did the things, they're denying the way we talk about them as bad things. So Thor, what was your question? Your mic is muted.
let me get that.
Sorry, I'm here. I can agree on that entirely. When it comes to somebody like Rush Limbaugh, it really becomes where his supporters were saying, well, don't speak well of the dead. They don't want to hear it. I mean, but the thing is, these are the same people who've heard all the crap that he did and harm, and they're okay with it. So the fact that people that are talking about it after he died of all the crap that he did and harm that he inflicted, those same people are not going to care because they didn't care while he was living.
Oh, yeah.
The other point is, yes, I agree with you. When it comes to not talking ill of the dead as a form of erasure, I agree. There are situations where out of fear or out of circumstance, there are people who don't talk about what happened to them in their lifetime till after the abuser has passed on.
Mm-hmm. Because it's not safe.
It's not safe.
Sometimes it's genuinely not safe.
And a lot of the stories people start finding out about after somebody died, because then it's like, okay, and then other people are like, well, you can't talk to them about them like that. They're dead. Leave them alone. And it's like, no, because
I'm alive.
Well, yes, that's it. And the other key piece is there's another part to that. And there's a study called ACEs, where they look at the different factors that have impacted people's health and their quality of being, called ACEs, ACES. And it's a measure. It's usually 3 or more factors that impact your life, and you're at risk of a continuation of those traumas or carrying those traumas throughout your life. And so this is why when you have that kind of generational stuff going on, they probably went through some crap too when they were youth. So this is where, by allowing those conversations, you can actually begin the process of getting the proper help to stop the cycle and catching it in its track. The other thing about when we're talking about celebrities and stuff, a good case in point is the contrast between somebody like Johnny Depp, who has had a huge throng of people supporting him, saying he's not like that, versus somebody like Marilyn Manson, who is now ending up with a laundry cart full of people saying, yeah, he's a dick. So this is where you look at that and go, okay, the people who need to say their piece should be allowed to say their piece. Mm-hmm. There is healing in that.
Yeah, there is. There is, definitely. And cycling back to the concept of what happens after this problematic person dies, I tend to go from the perspective that there isn't one single afterlife or way of being. I don't want to play that game. And I don't think that's fair to the various possibilities of reality. And I don't think the other world, the other side, is that set in stone. I think it's far more mutable than we as physically embodied creatures can really comprehend, except for the most fleeting moments. And then it's gone. So will he see
I
some
left
sort
some forks over there, honey.
of restitution for
You got them?
some afterlife restitution or realization?
Cut into wedges.
Not necessarily, but it depends, because I think the afterlife, regardless of which afterlife you're in, I strongly believe it is a place where you have the option to process, because we're souls that go from life to life to life to life. And there are things from past lives that I have had to work on healing for myself, because I didn't do that work in the afterlife like I should have. And that's a very individual thing. And most people are never going to consciously do that kind of work, but it also happens. And I think every afterlife that I've ever heard of does have some sort of a measure of, or a means or a mechanism for growth and realization after death. But do I think every single soul is going to want to do that work and be enlightened enough to be capable of fully doing that work? Probably not, because I know I didn't process things from previous lives when I died. I went, no, I don't wanna. And now it carried that baggage into this life. And if I could do that, there's no reason for me to think that other people wouldn't do that. And probably far worse, because it's hard to look at those things. It's hard enough to look at your baggage of one life when you're in that life, and it's something else to be in the afterlife. And I do believe in reincarnation. I pretty much believe reincarnation is universal, but I don't. So I talk from that perspective. And if you don't, whatever, you just do you. You don't have to agree with me, but if we can be so reluctant to look at those things, not even just because culturally as Americans, we tend to try to avoid the difficult, painful things. But even just as human beings, avoidance of pain and avoidance of difficulties is a strong motivation for all of us apes. We want the easy, low-hanging fruit. More often than not, we don't want to have to do the hard work, unless we really enjoy the hard work. And then it's not a painful, difficult thing. It becomes a joy. So when you're talking about shadow work, like working on those more hidden, not superficial aspects of yourself, where we tend to put the painful, difficult things, once you're in the afterlife and you're looking at potentially hundreds of lifetimes or thousands of lifetimes of that kind of pain that's in your soul's shadow, how overwhelming is that? Because we can't fully access that as embodied beings in the lives that we're in right now. So how hard would that be to be in the afterlife and suddenly be confronted with that? You'd have to be one hell of a strong person to be able to look at that face on and go, yes, I'm going to spend a lot of time here dealing with all of that. And
I was just picturing what if Rush Limbaugh was actually better in this life than he was in previous lives?
yeah, that scares me. I've thought about that. it's not going to be a do and done thing either, because it's not a do and done thing with shadow work in this life. Why would we expect it to be a do and done thing in the afterlife? So what's I think is more likely is if you do want to do that work, you end up processing things while you're there, but then you have to go be embodied again in order to work on it more and to experience more and understand more. And is everybody coming into a life having those kinds of lofty philosophical soul growth goals? Probably not. But some people do, and a lot of people do. And so, because there are some people that you meet and you're like, that person is really focused on this stuff. And then there are other people where they are perfectly happy just being mundane and doing mundane things and not worrying about any of that. And that's perfectly valid too. That is a perfectly happy way to live your life. It's certainly less trouble. It's a lot simpler. So
I'm pretty much in agreement with you.
That might be exactly what you need to do in this lifetime. I often thought I had such a wonderful life that this must be a vacation round for me.
mm-hmm.
Died this vacation.
Yeah. It's complicated. And honestly, I know everybody in the world would be better off if they would do shadow work and face those difficult things. But at the same time, the needs of life are sometimes so overwhelming that really adding that one more thing is just too much. And so I don't hold that against anyone. And but I do hope that over time we do have a tendency to grow. But I also think the afterlife isn't tied to linear time the way we are when we're embodied.
Yeah.
So who knows? Because your last life might have been 6 centuries down the line, or it might have been 1,000 years past. Or you might be keeping yourself ticking along with, or maybe time is completely an illusion. And once you're in the afterlife, it doesn't matter. I don't know, because I've never been there that I remember. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. So.
You know, that's a good point. Perhaps we don't remember the between lives part because we haven't got a vocabulary or a point of reference to think about it.
Yeah.
That's why we think about past lives instead.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm going to have to think about that one.
there's a lot to about the issue of memory and faculties that don't pass over from one life to another. The Buryat shaman, they find that that part of the ego, memory and faculties, that's the first to go. The Greeks, you drink the water of Nimnucine where you forget everything. According to the Hindus, they look at what gets carried over are habits, desires, and behavioral patterns that are really tucked in deep to, you called it a soul shadow, I call it a soul vehicle that wraps around our soul, and it gets imprinted with a person's lifetime. But at the same time, when we're talking about like Rush Limbaugh, a lot of that soul vehicle connections to the real world really depends on your truth and integrity. He didn't have any.
Yeah.
So it really destroys his capability of dealing with that in an afterlife regardless. I mean,
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like doing all the shadow work. You're actually getting closer to your soul and building the responses of how you deal with, how you act with your body in situations, and that those become behavioral patterns that you can carry to your next lifetime. May not have the memory, May
Oh
not
my
have the
God.
personality, the faculties,
String beans.
but it will imprint
No,
your
stop.
body
Oh my gosh.
the next incarnation so that you're prepped to be able to deal with it. You know,
Yeah.
it brings us energetic things to support that aspect of your spirit. So whatever
We talked about
work
past
we do
life
now,
and reincarnation and what happens in between. And
say again.
What happens between?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch.
I'm not sure who was even saying that.
Yeah, well, what happens in between is a whole other subject. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of it depends on culture and beliefs, but how we speak the truth of the dead can help them. Because, for example, my mother, she was an adored little old lady by everybody. She thought of herself as a socialite, maybe somewhat inept. To me and my brothers, she was psychologically neglectful, abusive. Like in that case, I don't know what kind of trauma she suffered, what kind of neurotic processes that made her act that way. I know it pretty much killed my older brother. It put me and my younger brother at odds. We didn't get to talk until she was dead. Everybody at the funerals, you know, we went through and let them do their thing. But with my brother, I told him, I says, you know, the only thing we forgot is to bring a steak, a hammer steak and a bucket of holy water. And he got a giggle out of that. And he told the funeral director that. He laughed because he knew what kind of a pain in the ass my mom was. So after that, on the ride home, my brother and I actually talked for the first time in 45 years, because that was the type of problems she generated between us.
Mhm.
So speaking the truth of her actually helped us heal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, speaking the truth is
Yeah.
critical for healing. You can't heal without it. You have to acknowledge and feel and speak the truth.
The
also,
three main,
I was morbid, and being able to follow someone into the afterlife, watching spirit components disambiguate is an interesting process. And then I read a book about how the shamans in Asia look at spirit components separating, so that what your soul is most attached to is what carries weight into your future. So I was fortunate enough to see my mom disengage that neurotic underworld aspect of herself, and she was able to go on. I didn't follow her past her connecting up with a shell of a lover that she had that was influential. His shell was attached to me for decades, and once she came back and she picked it up for their going on from there, they're both gone, thankfully, but they're both gone. So, yeah, speaking to that truth is important, because that helps frame energetically the truth in your attachments to them and your ability to let go, and for them to deal with the truth of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Rush Limbaugh is going to have to live with the truth that he has no soul because he killed it a long time ago. So I find most demons have no souls, but their shells are inherently coherent, but they don't deal with truth anymore. When you live with lies, all it does is, you know, it's only supported by people who support it. So I'm looking at a new batch of demons being born, and consequently, we have to fight that with the truth.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting way to
That's
look
what
at
I have to say. I'll shut up now.
I think Susan had another thing she wanted to say.
I wanted to add, you got to remember the three most important rules in a toxic system. Don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel.
Yeah.
So that talk thing, I'm so pleased that Arkenstone and his brother broke the first rule, and good can come of that.
Yeah. Yep. Now, truth is absolutely critical to healthy relationships of any kind, truth and honesty and openness. And if you can't have openness and honesty with someone, you can't trust them. And if you don't have trust, you can't have a healthy relationship. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about a relationship with another person, a family member, a pet, a god, anything. Yeah.
Now, this is where I ask you to wind it up, to give your closing statements. I have posted your links so that people can see some more of you.
Thanks.
Is there anything that you'd like especially to mention that people might enjoy?
On the stuff that I have available, most of my witchcraft stuff is on Patheos Pagan at the time, or at this moment. Most of it's up there. So I'm.
I don't know. I have only just discovered Sidney Eileen. I'm now a fan, and so.
I've got some.
We aren't speaking at events until we're all vaccinated.
Yeah.
So we can't push events you're about to speak at, but anyway.
Yeah, let's see. I'm hoping to start doing some videos now that I actually have a nice setup, so that I can actually do them relatively easily. And I'm trying to do some more art, but I have to deal with tremors. So that makes it difficult. But on my website, you'll find a bunch of my old art.
Oh God, it's gorgeous.
It's all very detail oriented. So the shaky hands means no. So that's a tough one, but being art is as important to me as being a witch. So, I am going to be appearing on Mysteries, Mystical Cupboard podcast at the end of the month. So in 2 weeks on Wednesday evening. So you'll find links to that on my website too.
Oh, good. Any last questions? All right, then I am just going to remind people that the Changing Times, Changing Worlds conference will be held virtually this year on November 8th to 14th, evening classes and panels Monday through Friday and all day long on the weekends. And we would love you to join check out our website, join the Facebook group, and check out our old Wednesday meetings on YouTube. And do ask for anything. I mean, once you have gone to her thing, you just write me and say, oh, can you get her to talk about such? And then I will come and bug her because that's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that is how it works. I am totally open to prompts because I can talk about a lot of different subjects.
That's true. I have found that speakers are much more eager to talk about something when they know somebody wants to hear it.
Yeah.
So, thank you again for being on, and
thank you for hosting me. And thank you for everyone.
And